In this lecture, we will be discussing some aspects of the nervous system. Specifically, we'll look at a general overview of the nervous system and talk about nervous tissue. So we'll begin with a general overview of the nervous system. We'll have a brief introduction to nervous tissue and nervous organs. We'll spend some time looking at the divisions of the nervous system. And then next we'll get into some details of the nervous tissue, including looking at the various cells of the nervous system. The function of the nervous system is to perform high-speed electrical and chemical communication for the body. This is how we very quickly can send send communication throughout the body. The nervous system helps us to sense information about both our internal and external environments. So right now you're sensing your external environment through things like your sense of vision and hearing and taste and smell, but you're also sensing information about your internal environment. Most of it you're not aware of. Most of that is subconscious. For example, right now your brain knows what your blood pressure is, but that's at a subconscious level. Then your nervous system has to process the sensory information. Right? So that involves things like making cognitive sense of what you're seeing. So taking the information from your eyes and then turning that into something that makes sense. Then the nervous system will help you to react if necessary to that information. So for instance, maybe you see an object like a bird flying at your head, right? Your reaction to that might be to duck down and away. Now your nervous system does work with another body system, and that's the endocrine system. So both the endocrine system and the nervous system work together to control almost all of your body functions. These two systems work together, in other words, to maintain homeostasis of your body. Endocrine communication is much slower though, so it's not high speed. It lasts much longer. There's hormones, which are chemicals used by the endocrine system. There are hormones in your body that were released maybe a month ago, and they're still circulating through your blood. And the endocrine system is much farther reaching than the nervous system. Additionally, the endocrine system is chemical only in nature. There's no electrical component to the endocrine system. There are a few organs to the nervous system. Most obviously is the brain and spinal cord, but also included in the nervous system organs are the sense organs. So these are things like your eyes, your ears, the olfactory organs in the nose, gustatory organs on the tongue. An often forgotten about organ of the nervous system are nerves. So nerves connect your nervous system with other systems, like nerves would connect your brain, for example, with a muscle, and nerves would connect your eyes to your brain. Nerves really are a lot like the electrical cords that we use in our houses all the time. If you look inside an electrical cord, what you're going to see are bundles of wires. When you look inside of a nerve, what you see are bundles of axons. Axons were the long, thin parts of a neuron that carry an electrical signal away from a neuron. And so nerves are just bundles and bundles of axons, and these axons are carrying electrical signals. So nerves carry electricity much like a cord does. There are two main types of nerves we find in the human body. Cranial nerves are named for the fact that they're attached to the brain, whereas spinal nerves are named for the fact that they're attached to the spinal cord. Next, we'll discuss the divisions of the nervous system. As you can see from this flowchart, there are two main divisions to the nervous system. The central nervous system, named for the fact that it's located centrally in the body. It's composed of the brain and spinal cord. And then there's the peripheral nervous system, which is pretty much everything else in the body that is nervous system that's not brain and spinal cord. So this would include, for example, your special sensory organs and also your nerves, those bundles of axons that we just mentioned. So the two major divisions of the nervous system are named based on their gross location. So as I mentioned, central nervous system is located centrally, whereas the peripheral nervous system is located on the periphery. In the picture over here, all of the yellow we see, that's all peripheral nervous system, whereas the central nervous system is just the spinal cord here and the brain. So the central nervous system is rather simple compared to the peripheral nervous system. Let's take a look at these divisions to the peripheral nervous system called sensory and motor. Sensory, of course, implies sensing something. The sensory division of the peripheral nervous system is also called the afferent division. That term afferent, if you recall, it means to bring something towards a center. The center is the central nervous system. So the afferent division brings signals towards the brain and spinal cord. This is usually coming from some sort of sensory organ. That's why we can also call it the sensory division. So we can say that the sensory division carries information from sensory receptors towards the CNS, the central nervous system. Then we have the motor division. Motor implies movement, right? So the motor division is often going to be sending signals to muscles. The motor division is also known as the efferent division. That's E-F-F-E-R-E-N-T. Efferent means to take something away from the center. So the efferent or motor division is taking signals away from the brain or spinal cord and sending them somewhere else, usually to muscles or glands. So in this case, with the motor division, we're going from the CNS to muscles or glands. Both the sensory and motor divisions themselves contain subdivisions. So coming back to this picture to show you this, sensory division here has subdivisions called visceral sensory and somatic sensory. And the motor division will have subdivisions called also visceral, but in this case motor, and then somatic motor. If you recall, that term visceral means guts. So guts include like the major organs within your trunk, so like your heart, your lungs, your intestines, your stomach, your bladder. Whereas somatic means of the body but not the guts. So this is going to include like the things we find in our appendages. So skin, skeletal muscle, bones are examples of things that would be involved with the somatic component. So let's first take a look at the sensory or afferent division of the peripheral nervous system. We have the two subdivisions, somatic sensory and visceral sensory. The somatic sensory division is going to carry signals away from things that are of the body but not the guts. So this is going to be involved with skeletal muscle, bone, joints, skin, and all the special sense organs except gustation. So whenever any of these things wants to send a signal towards the brain or spinal cord, those signals are sent through the somatic sensory division. So right now you're sending signals from your skeletal muscles and your bones and your joints, and you're sending those signals to your brain, and it's basically telling your brain where your body is in relationship to other parts of your body and in relationship to gravity and things of that nature. That's all involving your somatic sensory division. The visceral sensory division is going to involve your guts. So if your guts are sending signals towards the brain or spinal cord, that's visceral sensory. So if your heart, your glands, the smooth muscle in your intestines, the smooth muscle in your arteries, if any of that is sending signals towards your brain or spinal cord, that is going to be happening via the visceral sensory division. Gustation is the only special sense that's included in the visceral sensory division. So the other component of the peripheral nervous system was the motor or efferent division. That's when we would send signals to glands or muscles. Again, somatic means of the body, but not the guts. So in this case, we're going to be sending signals to things like our skeletal muscle, right? Whereas with the visceral motor division, we're going to be sending signals to things like our cardiac muscle, our smooth muscle, and our glands. The somatic motor division is a voluntary division, whereas the visceral motor division is involuntary. You cannot consciously control your heart rate and the movement of food through your intestines. That's visceral motor. But you can consciously control the movement of your skeletal muscles. That's somatic motor. Your visceral motor division is also known as the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic as in automatic. So this is a portion of your nervous system that's involuntary. It happens automatically. This is controlled at a subconscious level by your brain. It's going to be mostly controlled by areas of your brain like your medulla oblongata and your hypothalamus. The autonomic nervous system, or visceral motor division, does itself have two subdivisions called the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. You might have heard of these in a psychology class because they're often spoken about in psychology classes too. The sympathetic division is often called the fight or flight division because it helps your body to prepare the body to run away or fight off some sort of threat. So the sympathetic division will send like signals to your heart, increasing your heart rate, and it'll send signals to your lungs, increasing your respiratory rate. And all of this is to get your blood pumping so that you can better fight off or run away from some sort of threat. This sympathetic division in general increases automatic body activities, with the exception of digestion. It does the opposite to the digestive system. The sympathetic division turns down digestion. And if you think about it, that makes sense. If you're in an emergency situation and there's some sort of threat that you need to run away from, that's a very bad time to digest whatever it is that you had for lunch. You can put that off and wait until later. Now, the parasympathetic division is often called the rest and digest division. The parasympathetic division is what's controlling your body when you're at rest, so when you're not under threat, which is hopefully most of the time. So your parasympathetic division will do things like bring your heart rate down to a resting state, bring your respiratory rate down to a resting state. It's called the rest and digest division because it turns down or rests most of your automatic body systems, with the exception of digestion. Digestion is turned up under parasympathetic control, and this again makes sense. When you're resting, that is a good time to digest whatever it is that you had for lunch. You can think of the parasympathetic division as like a parachute. A parachute slows you down when you're falling through the sky, right? And the parasympathetic division slows down most of your body's activities with the exception of digestion. So we just finished discussing the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the visceral motor division. Don't forget, the visceral motor division is also known as the autonomic nervous system, which is part of the motor division, which is part of the peripheral nervous system. In this next section, we'll take a look at neural tissue, also called nervous tissue. So the nervous system includes all of the neural tissue in the body. In the picture here, we can see a very classic representation of nervous tissue. The very large cells, there's 3 of them, those are neurons, but all of the smaller little blue specks in the background, those are a type of cell that we find in nervous tissue called neuroglia. And neuroglia are the helper cells. The neurons are there for the high-speed electrical and chemical communication. So let's talk a little bit about neurons. We can classify neurons 2 different ways. We can classify them by their structure or by their function. If we're going to classify neurons by structure, there's 3 types: unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar. Over here we see a bipolar neuron. This is the soma, or the cell body of the neuron. That's where we find the nucleus and the majority of the organelles. You can see each of these neurons has a soma or cell body. If we count the extensions coming off the soma here, we see 1, 2 extensions coming off the soma. This is a bipolar neuron, bi as in 2 extensions off the soma. In the middle here we see a unipolar neuron. If you look, there's just 1 extension coming off the soma, hence unipolar. Now that 1 extension does branch, but we only count the extensions that come off the soma, and that's 1 extension here, so unipolar. This is a multipolar neuron. It's called multipolar because there are many extensions coming off the soma. In this case, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6 extensions. Again, we can classify neurons by function too, in which case we have sensory, motor, and interneurons. In this picture here, what we're looking at is someone trying to write with a pen. Right? First, we have to sense the pen in our hand, and we use a sensory neuron to do that. Okay? You can see the cell body of the sensory neuron here. A sensory neuron sends a signal towards the center. Sometimes sensory neurons are also called afferent neurons, because afferent means towards the center. At the center, we're going to find interneurons. So the interneurons are the neurons we find between sensory neurons and motor neurons. So here we have a couple interneurons up in the brain sensing or helping us to make sense of the information coming from the sensory neuron. And then if we want to send a signal out to a muscle, we're going to use a motor neuron. So there's an upper motor neuron in the brain and a lower motor neuron associated with the spinal cord. In terms of the structure of a multipolar neuron, we are going to take a look at that. We're going to use the multipolar neuron as our example neuron because most of the neurons in our bodies are multipolar neurons. So again, the cell body is also called the soma, and that's where we find the nucleus and the majority of the organelles and the majority of the cytoplasm in the neuron. A multipolar neuron has several short branched dendrites, and it's the job of the dendrites to bring signals into the neuron. And a multipolar neuron has a single long axon. The axon is also called the nerve fiber. The axon's job is to carry action potentials. Action potentials are very dramatic changes in the transmembrane potential. It's the electrical events that we associate with a multipolar neuron. And the axon structure is very critical to its function. So let's take a look at the structures of the axon. First, there's something called the axon hillock, which technically is part of the soma. It's the end of the soma just before the axon, just before the first part or initial segment of the axon. So in this picture here, the red arrow is pointing to the axon hillock. Axolemma is just a fancy name for the cell membrane of the axon. Telodendria are the little end branches of an axon, and at the very end of the telodendria we find synaptic knobs, also called synaptic terminals. So over here we have the telodendria of the axon, and circled in red is an example of a synaptic knob or a synaptic terminal. The synaptic knobs are filled with vesicles called synaptic vesicles, and these synaptic vesicles themselves are filled with a chemical called a neurotransmitter. The synaptic knobs end at a space called the synaptic cleft. So in this picture here, what we can see is the very end of an axon, and this thing that looks kind of like a doorknob here, this is a synaptic knob. These little blue circles, right, those are synaptic vesicles, and the little dark blue dots within the synaptic vesicles, those dark blue dots are representing the neurotransmitter. Notice that there's a space here on the other side of the synaptic knob. The space is called the synaptic cleft. A synapse is the name for where a neuron is going to communicate with another cell. So we have three different things that we find at a synapse: a presynaptic cell, a postsynaptic cell, and a synaptic cleft. The presynaptic cell is always a neuron, and it's the neuron that's sending a message. And neurons send messages by releasing neurotransmitter. So the presynaptic cell is usually specifically the synaptic knob of a neuron. The postsynaptic cell is the cell that receives the neurotransmitter. There are different types of cells that can act as a postsynaptic cell. A postsynaptic cell could be another neuron, it could be a muscle cell, it could be a gland cell. So the postsynaptic cell can be different types of cells. The space between the presynaptic cell and the postsynaptic cell is called the synaptic cleft. So in the picture here, this pink knobby-like structure is representing our presynaptic cell. Over here in bluish gray, we have our postsynaptic cell, and notice the space between the two, that's the synaptic cleft. Most neurons do not directly touch the cell they're communicating with. There's usually a space there, that synaptic cleft. We'll talk more about that later in the semester. This is an actual histological slide of muscle tissue with synaptic knobs embedded in it. So here's a synaptic knob, here's a synaptic knob. You can see a few more. And those synaptic knobs are creating a synapse with a muscle fiber, a muscle cell. In this cartoon picture, what we see is a synapse between one neuron in blue and another neuron in yellow. The neuron in blue is the presynaptic cell, and the neuron in yellow is the postsynaptic cell. Over here, the presynaptic cell is a neuron, but the postsynaptic cell is a muscle fiber, a muscle cell. So neurotransmitters are the chemicals that are released by the presynaptic cells. Neurotransmitters bind to receptors. If you remember, neurotransmitters and hormones are the main communicating chemicals used by the human body, and they always bind to receptors. So neurotransmitters and hormones both bind to receptors. So the neurotransmitters bind to receptors that are located on the cell membrane of the postsynaptic cell. If you remember, it's the job of the postsynaptic cell to receive the neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters don't stay around forever. They're eventually removed. Oftentimes they're broken down by enzymes found in the synaptic cleft. Also very common is the fact that neurotransmitters are reabsorbed by the presynaptic cell. Your body is very good at reusing things, and so the presynaptic cell can actually take back in the neurotransmitter that it released, and then it can reuse that neurotransmitter. And that process is called reabsorption. Now, heading away from neurons and looking at neuroglia, so neuroglia were another type of cell that we would find in neural tissue. Neuroglia make up a very large part of the nervous system volume. And the neuroglia are helper cells. It's their job to make sure everything is perfect for the neurons, to make sure that the ion concentration around the neurons is correct, to make sure that neurons have enough water and there's not too much garbage. So as it says on the slide, neuroglia preserve the physical and biochemical structure of neural tissue and are essential to the survival and function of neurons. There are different types of neuroglia: ependymal cells, astrocytes, microglia, oligodendrocytes, which are also called oligodendroglia, and Schwann cells are a few of the most common types of neuroglia. In this picture here, we can see several types of neuroglia. We see astrocytes in green here. And you notice the astrocytes are around a blood vessel. And astrocytes are important for forming something called the blood-brain barrier, which helps to separate your brain circulation from the rest of your body. Here we have some ependymal cells that help to make cerebrospinal fluid. Over here, these brownish cells, these are neurons, but if you notice, the neurons have neuroglia associated with them. Oligodendrocytes, and the oligodendrocytes are wrapping around the axons of these neurons. Microglia here, they're sort of like the maintenance personnel of neural tissue. It's their job to clean up messes and do various other things to preserve the physical and biochemical nature of the tissue. I want to spend some time talking about a structure that's produced by some neuroglia, and the structure is called the myelin sheath. Myelin sheaths can be formed by two types of neuroglia, the oligodendrocytes and the Schwann cells. The difference between the two is really location. If we're looking at neurons in the brain, we can see neurons in the brain associated with neuroglia called oligodendrocytes, whereas neurons in the peripheral nervous system, we're going to see those associated with the Schwann cells. Basically, to form a myelin sheath, what happens is extensions of the Schwann cell or oligodendrocyte wrap around an axon to form the myelin sheath. So in this picture here, what we see is the nucleus of an oligodendrocyte. And then notice parts of the cell membrane of the oligodendrocyte are branching off, and those branches are wrapping around this structure here. This is an axon of a neuron. And notice that the oligodendrocyte has wrapped itself several times around the axon of this neuron. This structure here, this wrapped up area, this is the myelin sheath. So really all we have here is cell membrane wrapping around an axon. Right? Cell membranes, if you recall, are mostly made of phospholipids. Right? So these myelin sheaths are essentially made of fat. They're made of phospholipids. And fat is a very, very good insulator, and that's what we're going to use the myelin sheaths for. What a myelin sheath does is it increases the speed of a nerve impulse by insulating the axon. What that means is that the action potential, that electricity, will travel faster along an axon that has been myelinated. And it's sort of like bare wire versus wire that's been covered with a coating. The coating on a wire can make the conduction faster. And what we're doing here is we're coating the wires of our nervous system. We're coating the axons of our neurons, allowing the electricity to travel faster along these axons. The myelin sheaths form in little chunks, right? So you can see we have a bunch of myelin sheath here on an axon, and then there's no myelin sheath, and then there's myelin sheath again, but then there's no myelin sheath. The areas of the axon covered with myelin sheath are called internodes, And the areas of the axon not covered with myelin sheath are called nodes. They're also known as nodes of Ranvier. And what happens during an action potential is that the electrical impulse appears to jump quickly from node to node along the axon. And we call this propagation of the action potential. And we'll talk more about this later in the semester. This picture illustrates a myelin sheath forming with a Schwann cell instead of an oligodendrocyte. Again, the oligodendrocyte myelin sheaths we find in the central nervous system, like the brain and spinal cord, whereas the Schwann cell myelin sheaths we're going to find in the peripheral nervous system. They're very much the same. We have cell membrane wrapping around an axon. The difference here is that the entire Schwann cell wraps around the axon, as compared to with the oligodendrocytes. Notice that the nucleus does not wrap around the axon. So it's a little bit different, but it works out to be the same in terms of function. Here we're looking at a cross-section through an axon, right? So this would be inside the axon, so there'd be cytoplasm in here. And this thick area here, this is the myelin sheath, many layers wrapped around the outside of this axon.